Thank you, Neil. And thank you for having me. Like Neil said, my name is Chris Harbosh. I work in the city's Office of Emergency Management. I'm here tonight to talk a little bit about what I do and what my team does, and what the city does during emergencies. I'm going to talk about emergency preparedness, what we can do as residents and as a community during emergencies. So to start with, and I apologize, I have a 4-month-old puppy who is probably going crazy in the background. So to start, what is emergency management? Now, simply put, emergency management is a framework to help communities reduce vulnerabilities to threats and hazards and cope with disasters. In the city of Ottawa, we use this management of objectives flower to help prioritize our goals during emergencies. So if you kind of look at this graph, you'll see things like save lives, treating the sick and injured, protecting the safety of first responders. These things all lead into maintaining public confidence. When I say maintain public confidence, I mean the public can be confident that the city is going to be there for residents of Ottawa when emergency happens to provide supports that they need. Now, as I mentioned, I work for the Office of Emergency Management, and whenever people ask me what I do, I say there's kind of two different sides to my job. There is during a normal day in the city of Ottawa, and then there is during an emergency situation. When we are in an emergency situation, my boss likes to say that we are the chapeau on top of the city's first response. We are the organizational piece at the top that brings coordination to all the different services that are involved in an emergency response. When we are not in an emergency situation, my team is responsible for maintaining the city's municipal emergency plan. Now, every city in Ontario is legislatively required to have a municipal emergency plan. And my team, again, is responsible for maintaining it and making improvements to it and also administering it during emergencies. We also conduct training and exercises for city staff. And we engage with external partners to try to grow our program. Personally, I do a lot of emergency preparedness work, public education, also engaging with NGOs like St. John's Ambulance to grow our program and provide more services to residents when an emergency happens. Now, who has a role in emergency management? Simply put, everyone does, and as residents of the city of Ottawa, it's our responsibility to look after ourselves and our loved ones when an emergency happens. It's our responsibility to be prepared for these situations. Now, you'll see here that it goes beyond just residents and families and individuals. See, communities have their own role. The government has their role. Critical infrastructure partners like Hydro and Enbridge, they all have their role in emergency management. Now, when it comes to emergency preparedness, the general principle is that we should try to be prepared for up to 72 hours and take care of those and ourselves and our families for that long when an emergency happens. The general rule is that emergencies happen when we least expect them to, often when we are spread out, not at home. So we need to take all these things into consideration when we're doing planning. Again, the best protection is knowing what to do. Oftentimes, it is normal to not think clearly when an emergency happens. So, by having a plan and practicing that plan ahead of time, you can be more confident that when an emergency does happen, you'll be able to think clearly and you'll know what to do. Now, the first step in emergency planning is knowing the risks that you're planning for. And I always like to include this graphic in any presentation that I give, just to give a little perspective as to how big Ottawa actually is. We have 2,800 square kilometers that we're responsible for. And as you can see from this picture, other major municipalities around Canada fit into Ottawa without overlapping. So the reason that I point this out is that with such a large geographic area, we have parts of the city that are impacted by different hazards and risks. Now, our municipal emergency plan is an all hazards approach. It's meant to respond to any type of hazard or emergency that occurs. And we actually have a list of 53 different hazards and risks that we measure our plan against. Now, for residents and for families, you only need to think about, what occurs regularly or in the last couple of years, what has impacted you and your family. In Ottawa, we need to prepare for things like high wind and tornadoes, flooding, extreme heat and cold, extreme winter weather events. Uh, Fire is always something that we need to be prepared for. Transportation incidents, these are things that have occurred in Ottawa and are likely to occur again, especially power outages. We have to think about power outages. They are one of the most impactful emergencies that we can deal with, especially if we're also dealing with an extreme heat or cold event. Now, when you are doing your emergency planning, it is important to take into consideration two possible outcomes, and that is that you may need to shelter in place, which is to stay home. It is not safe to leave, or that you may need to evacuate. Now, when you are taking into consideration the hazards and risks that you're planning for, and when you are doing your planning, we also need to think about the impacts to climate and how that is changing. Now, as a city, we look 10, 20, 30 years down the line. We can see that we're expecting to see hotter summers, fewer cold days, more rain. The point being is that we need to look long term when we're doing our emergency planning and take these things into consideration ahead of time so that we can be prepared for them before they occur. So, step two in being prepared is making an emergency plan. Now, you are not ready until you have an emergency plan. As I said, it's normal to not be able to think clearly during an emergency. So, by having an emergency plan, we can, again, bring a little bit of confidence to ourselves that we'll be able to we know what to do during an emergency. Now, I already sent some of these brochures ahead, and some of you may have seen them already. These are our Are You Ready pamphlets. This one is in Spanish. We have them in English, French, Spanish, Russian, Somalian, Arabic, and Chinese. These are designed to help families and individuals start making an emergency plan. They have great checklists and a value of information that will help you get started. And we are looking at improving these booklets as well. We're updating them and we're going to be re-releasing them and hopefully in the next year. Now, when it comes to making a plan, there are some key components of an emergency plan that every plan should have. Every plan should have emergency contacts, a list of important numbers, including family, neighbors, who may be next door neighbors, and any emergency services, family doctors. You can have school contacts if your kids are in school, you can have contacts at work. And then everyone should also have a list of these contacts. You also need to consider escape routes or evacuations. Think about how you are going to leave your home and where you're going to go when an emergency happens. Emergency meeting points are pre-designated locations outside of your home and neighborhood where family members can regroup. Like I said, it's normal when an emergency happens that we are not at home, that we are at work, at school, we are spread out from our family, and it may not be safe to return to our home. So by having an emergency meeting place pre-designated ahead of time, your family will know where to go. You can meet up safely. You should also take into consideration emergency communications, a good strategy for staying in touch if separated, including an out of town emergency contact who's likely not to be impacted by the same emergency that you and your family can contact to let them know that you're okay. These are all important parts of an emergency plan. And again, we have these very helpful pamphlets and we have a lot of information on our website that will help you to begin writing your own plans. Step three to being prepared is to get an emergency kit. Now, ideally, you should have three types of emergency kits. You should have a grab and go kit, something that you can take with you quickly in case you need to evacuate in a short amount of time. You should have a shelter in place kit, a more substantial kit that can sustain you for up to 72 hours. Like I said, with you, if it's not safe to leave your home. And then you should also have an emergency kit in your vehicle for roadside emergencies. Now, um, some important things that every emergency kit should have is drinking water. You can 4 liters per person per day. And again, if you're doing a stay-at-home kit, you need to have up to 3 days worth and think of every single person in your family, including any pets you may have. Every kit should have copies of important documents like passports or insurance information, as well as extra cash, an extra copy of your emergency plan and an emergency contacts. Have non-perishable food items, in your stay-at-home kit. If you're having like non-perishable canned food, things that require cooking, make sure you have a device that you can cook them with. If we have a power outage, if you have a barbecue, you can use that. You can use Coleman grills. But if you are going to keep food that requires heating in your emergency kit, make sure you have a way to heat it without power. Also consider having a crank or a battery powered radio and flashlight in your emergency kit. A basic first aid kit, any infant needs for children or babies. Do not forget about any personal medication or medical aids, lighters and matches, a manual can opener, supplies for your pets, a phone charger, and power banks. And these are a big one, especially during power outages. One of the easiest ways to stay connected is with our cellular devices. But if we can't charge them, then they are useless to us. So having a power bank or some sort of battery pack is essential these days. Of course, consider personal hygiene items as well as extra clothing and footwear. And for a vehicle kit, should have things like jumper cables, emergency roadside flares, should have maps, extra clothes, gloves, de-icer. I always think of if you're driving home late at night and freezing rain hits and you slide off the road and now you're stuck in a ditch. What do you need to stay warm even until a tow truck is able to get to you, right? So those are the kinds of things that you should have in a vehicle kit. And again, these pamphlets that we have a lot of information on what you should put in an emergency kit. And there is a wealth of information online, helpful checklists, including on our own website, that you can use to build an emergency kit. Or you can buy pre-made kits from most stores like Canadian Tire, hardware stores, or Amazon. These places you can buy pre-made emergency kits. Now, we also need to take our pets and service animals into consideration when we're doing our own emergency preparedness. Bring this up because a lot of public shelters in Ottawa, if you do need to evacuate or if you aren't able to return to your home, aren't able to accommodate pets. So you need to think about these things ahead of time. Do you have a kennel set up that you can drop your dog or your cat off in case of an emergency, or a family member that they can stay with? Should make these arrangements ahead of time. And again, when you have an emergency kit, make sure you are planning for your dog as well, or cat, or whatever your pet is. Add extra water, add food for them. How will you transport your pets if you need to, including a pet carrier? So think about these things ahead of time. And you also need to take into consideration any additional health needs that you may have. Medical management considerations include medicine, nutritional health needs, prescriptions, medical assistive devices. If you have mobility issues, you have a walker or a wheelchair, or if you require emergency power or power for medical devices, you need to take these things into consideration, have battery packs ahead of time. Again, a list of prescriptions. If you have medical professionals that you need to stay in touch with, make sure that you have a way to contact them during an emergency and also that they know how to contact you during an emergency. And I'd also say it's important also to have a support network when you're doing your emergency plan. If you do require additional supports or additional check, you should have a support network of people who you can rely on that can come check on you during an emergency. So when we move beyond personal and family emergency preparedness, we can start thinking about what we can do as a community to support each other during emergencies. Not everyone has the means to look after themselves during an emergency or put an emergency kit together. Not all of us have family in the city that we can rely on. Um, there are people who are more vulnerable or more impacted by emergencies. And one of the best things that you can do as a community is to know who these people are ahead of time. That way, when an emergency does happen, you can direct first responders to reach these people first. An integral part of a successful emergency response is making sure that no one falls through the cracks. So think of who in your community may be isolated, may who may be new to the country and not have family here, who may be elderly and living alone, who may have, again, some disabilities that and may require extra assistance during an emergency. Mapping those things out ahead of time and being able to share that information with first responders will speed up the response and allow us to get to those people quickly. Now, we've seen communities take emergency planning into their own hands around Ottawa, start enacting programs like street captains to do wellness checks and door knocks during an emergency. And those things can go such a long way, again, to reporting that information back up to first responders, because you never know what you might find during an emergency situation just by knocking on your neighbor's doors. You can also consider as a community stockpiling, again, food and water, blankets. Maybe someone in your community has a generator that can be used. We've seen in some communities people driving around with a generator, helping people open up their garages during a power outage because the cars are stuck inside, and that's the only way that they can maybe get to a family member's house. So these are the kinds of things that make communities strong in Ottawa. The strength of communities that you've lived together for a long time. We know each other. I've lived here in the city for my whole entire life. I have friends across the city, and I know that I can rely on. I have a big network of people, and even in my own community, I've started to see emergency planning kind of take hold, and that community emergency preparedness notion take place. Now, this is something that our office is a big proponent of. And we have released our community emergency toolkit on our website that is designed to help communities, community associations, and large organizations start to think about emergency planning at that community level. It has helpful information about hazards and risks and roles and responsibilities in emergency response, as well as activities that you can take part in before, during, and after an emergency as a community to help make your own community more resilient and ultimately make Ottawa a more resilient city. Now, City of Ottawa does offer a wide variety of supports during emergencies. And when an emergency happens, especially in the hard impacted areas, you can expect to see these supports, things like the mobilization of community support centers, where you can find services like device charging, washrooms and showers. We'll have food, snacks, meals, and hydration, as well as temporary emergency accommodations if required. We also bring different city services and members from the Insurance Bureau of Canada, and various NGO partners with psychosocial supports into these support centers as well during emergencies. The city conducts wellness visits in impacted areas, and you can expect to see both first responders and volunteer organizations out in communities that are impacted, knocking on doors and checking on people. This is a big part of emergency response and how we can find out who may need our help. We also have a mechanism now for emergency food distribution. We always had the ability to get meals to these community support centers, but we learned that not everyone is always able to get to these support centers. So we now have a emergency food security task force that is able to directly deliver hot meals during emergencies to impacted areas that, again, maybe aren't able to get to the support centers, or maybe we are in a situation like the derecho in 2022 where it is so widespread that we need to be in many different places all at once. So these are all things that the city is responsible for during an emergency, and these are things that we are always trying to improve. I always say the silver lining of any emergency that we go through is it allows us to go and look back at not only what went well, but what didn't go well and what we can improve on. So we're always looking to augment our plan and grow it however we can. That includes, again, partnering with NGOs like Salvation Army, St. John's Ambulance, Ottawa Volunteer Search and Rescue, as well as, again, establishing relationships with organizations like the Ottawa Food Bank and their network of partners. These are all things that we've done in the last several years. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention these integral numbers. These are all important numbers during emergencies. 911, of course, is for life-threatening emergencies. Then you have 311 for non-emergency calls to the city services like public works or building code or bylaw. You have 211 for information on government and local social services. 811 is for assistance navigating health services in Ontario. And 988 is a suicide crisis hotline. And this one is especially important. You know, when an emergency happens, we often think of the physical impacts, to property and personal injuries, but we often ignore the emotional impacts and the psychosocial impacts. So it's important to also take these into consideration during an emergency. And these numbers should all be part of everyone's emergency plan. We all of our devices, smartphones are automatically signed up for Alert Ready in Ontario. Those are those emergency notifications, Amber alerts that you might get. You can also sign up for the WeatherCan app, which are emergency weather notifications from Environment Canada. And our office is also developing a emergency notification system for ourselves to use and for the city to use that residents of the city will be able to sign up for. And we will be able to push information out during an emergency, such as the location of support centers, any incoming severe weather we might be looking at, where services are, recovery operations, updates, all these things, any emergency notifications that we can send out, we want to, and we're looking always to expand our ability to do so. The last piece of advice that I want to give is that the next emergency shouldn't be the first time you put your plan into practice. If you are developing an emergency plan and writing a plan for you and your family, you should make sure to practice it and that everyone knows what their role in your plan is. You don't want an emergency to happen only to find out that your plan doesn't work from the start. And then you're scrambling and you're not sure what to do. So if you are making an emergency plan, please make sure that you and your family are practicing it. And that's been it for me. This is my contact information. That's my email for the City of Ottawa. That is also our Are You Ready programs email, where you can send emails. It's a general emergency preparedness inbox. You can send questions or requests for presentations or for more information. If you want some of these pamphlets, you can request them there. And then you can also go to our website. It's ottawa.ca/are you ready. It's not the easiest website to navigate right now, and we recognize that, and we are in the middle of making some vast improvements to our website. So I hope this information has been helpful. Again, this is my contact information. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me at any time, and I would be happy to help. And I'd also be happy to help with any emergency planning that you might be interested in personally or as a community. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. I guess some questions I would have, and certainly people are free to send questions right now if they want to get answers from Chris. You can send them to info@canadabeaverbrook.ca, and I can pull them up for Chris. Um, I guess the question is, you've now done at least a couple of talks here in Canada North. And I'm going to be asking this question of our councillor as well. Um, what exactly do we have in from a community standpoint, from a city perspective, in terms of community shelters, for example? We have a number of larger facilities, including the Richcraft Center, which is up in Canada Lakes. We've got the Mille Lacs Center. We get various halls, such as there's the rink on Terry Fox.
Yep.
So there's quite a number of those things. I'm not aware that those things have ever advertised themselves as being available as emergency
Mhm.
locations.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit about that, or is that something that the community needs to work with our councillor on?
Of course. So when it comes to those community support centers, um, we put those in impacted areas. So like again during the derecho, the Maryville area was heavily impacted. The Howard Darwin Arena was converted into a support center. Any city facility that can take in a lot of people, that has backup power, and that gives the city the ability to put those resources there, can be used as one of these support centers. We don't have a list of them or identify them ahead of time because we don't want people to show up at a center that hasn't been activated as a community support center during an emergency if it maybe has lost power. So a large facility like the complexes you just mentioned, like the Richcraft complex or the rinks, those, if Canada North was, suddenly victim to a long-term power outage, several days, you would almost certainly see those facilities open with additional resources and the city putting that messaging out that they are open as such. Again, you might not be able to recently recall them being open because they may just have not been needed in those areas. If they aren't impacted, um, by the emergency. They may just be open as well for regular programming. The city does try to keep those programs going during situations if it's possible to. But again, if we're dealing with long-term widespread situations like power outages where those facilities are needed for device charging, showers, people to come and just stay warm, whatever it might be, that's when you'll see them activated with extra services. So I don't know if that answers your question, but again, if that Canada North area around the Richcraft complex was suddenly without power for 3 days, you would again almost certainly see additional resources there. Again, we go where we are needed, basically, the city does.
Yeah, I guess the potential problem is an incident happens and power's out. Now you've lost a means to communicate as to what those centers are at if there's not something that's been designated as a potential site.
Yep. And that's when you'll see, the value in those wellness visits is where we can go out into neighborhoods and directly share that information with people. If communications are down and we can't broadcast that information through our regular channels, then the city will be out in the community letting people know where to go, right? The people have to know where those resources are. And again, that's why we're also looking to always expand our ability to get that information out quickly during emergencies. So
As as you said, Chris, you did ship us a whole bunch of the home response and planning documents. So we're going to be posting that up as a follow-up to this meeting, saying that we do have them available, and people want to stop by, they can come and pick them up. So we may simplify that and perhaps talk to our counselor and make sure she's got a sample of those things, because that's pretty centrally located for people in Canada North. Unlike some counselors are. A lot of them get sucked into downtown a lot or maybe in locations that are not typically open a great deal. So that's certainly something we will do, and also make them available at the community center, the KBCA Community Center. All right, I'm not seeing any further questions coming in through. But as I said, we'll also post your information for people to contact, and so if they have additional questions, and ask them to CC us so that we're aware that there's things that have been requested. Other than that, certainly look forward to talking a little bit more depth about having some, in community trained people who can be reached out with communication stuff that supplements the first responders, because sometimes like a certain tree just hit the 110 kV lines. That's just something that probably somebody needs to know exactly where that location is in a pretty short notice.
100%. And I'll share these slides with you as well. I'll send them in an email to you tomorrow.
Okay, no, that's fabulous. And we'll also put them with the recording of this presentation so that people can hear it from you and move forward with that. So
great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to present tonight. I appreciate it, Neil.
Thank you.